Hey listeners, and welcome back to Mountain Laurels. Sorry for my creaky voice. I'm recovering from a cold, unfortunately. One that has reminded me what NyQuil and DayQuil can do for someone. In my last episode, I had a great conversation with Willa Johnson about documenting the Appalachian region as a creative and all of the complexities that come with that. Along those same lines, I wanted to explore what it's like to be a reporter in the region. Journalists have different standards, different goals, and often have to work at a much quicker pace. This can be really complicated in a place like Central Appalachia. My guest this week is Katie Myers. Katie reports on climate change in Appalachia through a partnership between GRIST and Blue Ridge Public Radio in Western North Carolina. She previously served as a Climate Solutions Fellow at GRIST and as an economic transition reporter in Eastern Kentucky with Ohio Valley Resource and WMMT. Her work has also appeared in the BBC, NPR, Belt Magazine, and The New Republic, among others. As you'll hear in this episode, Katie has reported on multiple climate catastrophes in Central Appalachia, as well as what recovery after a storm really looks like. Unfortunately, Katie is uniquely suited for this type of reporting, and it's reporting that we really, really need in the region right now. I hope you enjoy this conversation. I'm really excited that you're able to talk to me. Also, it's been a long time. I feel like maybe 2 years since we've actually talked face to face and not through text or Instagram posts. So I'm excited to get to talk to you. Maybe the last time we saw each other in person was around the floods in Eastern Kentucky.
I think it might have been. Yeah, I'm really glad you reached out.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's also wild. I'm just oh yeah, that was 3
that was
years ago.
3 years at 3.5.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And at that time you were already, or were you still reporting with WMT at that time, or were you at GRIST?
I was at WMT.
Okay. So, for those that don't know, in July of 2022, Eastern Kentucky, I think it affected 13 counties, experienced a 1,000-year flood, is what it was called in the beginning, where we were. I don't know if you were actually there at the time that it happened, but I was in Letcher County at the time. 9 inches of rain fell in, I want to say overnight is the best way to put it. It just happened overnight. 9 inches of rain. I don't know the exact number of hours. I think it got up to 22 feet is what the North Fork in downtown Whitesburg read. These are numbers ingrained in my brain. I don't even have these written down. This is just from trauma. But you were there, and you played a really interesting role to me, and you do, because one, we were doing a lot of mutual aid stuff, and you were involved in mutual aid stuff, but also you're a climate reporter. And this is a community that you're part of and invested in, and you just watch them go through a climate disaster, and you also have to report on everything that's happening. So I'm really interested in how you, because I believe this was the first time it happened to you. Not the last, which we'll get to later. But this is the first time it happened to you, and I'm really interested where was your mind when all of this was happening, both in the community but also as a reporter?
So, in order to set that up, I'll backpedal and say, fun fact, I had a preview the week I started at WMMT in 2021. Which was that there was a round of flooding that felt big at the time, but wasn't nearly as large, that hit Breathitt County, and Hazard, Perry County, that kind of area in, I believe it was February, of that year, maybe March.
I remember
So,
that. I think it was, yeah, it was going into March for sure. Yeah.
yeah, and that was when I was still getting comfortable with my audio equipment and everything. That was my first radio job, so I was juggling all these recorders and stuff, and I like talked to a traumatized firefighter and then realized I hadn't been recording that whole time. And anyway, lots of snafus, but it was like, that moment I remembered the entire time, that feeling of like having to roll up on people in the worst moment of their lives and ask them what had happened. And like seeing people outside their house, taking their mud, their mucky couches out and trying to make sense of like of this thing that had happened to them and make sense of what they needed to do next. And what a like a wrenching feeling that was to, and what a strange way to interact with someone in that moment. And so I remember the night of before the flood. I was at the infamous Appalachian Writers Workshop in Hindman.
Yeah, okay. I had no idea you were there. You are like I know several people who were there. So then you're like the fourth or fifth person. I know it was like I mean, Hindman, like I said, it was like 13 counties, and Hindman, especially where the Riders Retreat was located, really, really hard hit. Wow.
Yeah, and I was sleeping on a hill, so I didn't know what was going on, but I remember the night before I was watching the rain and the lightning and like drinking bourbon with some poets on the, porch and kind of having a fun time watching it all and then thinking to myself like I'm glad I have my recorder with me because like I wonder how this is all going to shake out tomorrow. And I went to bed and I woke up with the general manager of WMMT calling me on the phone. It's must have been 7 a.m. and it was still a little dark even, so maybe it was earlier than that. It was like maybe 6 or 6:30, asking me if I was okay. Um, and I looked out the window and I saw the water had gone down a little bit, but I saw how swollen Troublesome Creek had gotten. I saw, an upturned truck in the creek. And like just this sort of, I think until you see a flood, and I'm sure remember this, you just don't realize the like detritus of it all. The trash and the debris and like all this stuff that just ends up strewn everywhere. And I just remember seeing that. It was like just these remnants of people's lives just like all over the street. Um, and so I mean, I got out my recorder and I was like, I guess I'm gonna just, point my microphone at the creek and get some creek sound and kind of walk around Hindman and see what happens. But no one really prepares you to do flood reporting, and like even if you kind of know it's your job to do when it happens, you just like psychically just like are always going to be a little unprepared. And so I just remember like for that first week at the end of every day um of doing that thing where I was like, I would see someone cleaning out their house and I would stop by their house and I would try to be, give people every out that I could to not talk to me, but also ask them if they would talk to me. And, there would just come a saturation point where I would just like sit in my car with a headache and like couldn't talk to anybody anymore and, wonder if I'd gotten the right things and wonder if I was giving, sending the story out in the right way or you just like are turning that over and over in your mind. And of course, our station WMMT had been knocked out of commission, so we couldn't even air locally. And the way that it worked was that I would send my tape to Louisville, and then Louisville would, sort of send it to all the other stations. And so maybe it was airing on WEKU, and that was the only way it got to people. So it was sort of a helpless moment and a moment of, just trying to do what I could with what I had. And you just always wish you could do more. I think you're just
Yeah.
never gonna
I
do enough.
mean, I think like all of us after that were like when you started talking about just seeing things going down the river, I just had this memory of like once the floodwaters went down and being in downtown Wattsburg and because the Apple Shop building was hit and seeing old film strips of film in every part of the street. And I was just like, whoa, this had to come from here. There's no, and it's just like all of the things that we think are like safely stored just being in the either in the creek or like on Main Street or, just things turned over in houses and stuff. It really was so, whoa, how did this happen? Especially because we didn't really have a warning, which I think is another thing that um, hasn't been talked about probably enough in that particular instance. Is like, and now I think we get warned quite a bit for even like small things. It's like the creeks could flood, guys, which I appreciate really. But you mentioned too, like going up to people as they're cleaning out their homes, and I was so wrapped up in like doing mutual aid work at this time. Like I honestly don't remember 3 months after. Like they're a blur. It's just totally a blur. But I do remember listening to a story that you did, and I cannot remember the story, but I remember thinking to myself, oh my gosh, this is so important. I'm so glad Katie's doing this. And I wonder what, like, because, I talked with Willow about how hard storytelling in Central Appalachia is already because of people's distrust of government and people coming in and like telling stories. And like, I think a lot of that distrust is valid. But then I'm thinking of you as a reporter and also someone who's like entrenched in the community, but you're also a reporter. Like people know you're a reporter, and like just asking people to tell their stories. I just kept thinking about like people's sensibilities were already so heightened before that about storytelling in the region. And did you come up against anything like? I know you said like you're giving them every reason not to talk to you. You're like, you don't have to talk to me. But like, did you, was there anything that maybe you got confronted with that you weren't expecting, or like were you just like open to whatever, like any sort, because emotions were just so heightened after the flood.
Yeah, no, it was an emotional moment, and I think it was almost the opposite of what I expected. I expected people to not want to talk to me. Like I expected it to be really hard. And it was easy in a lot of cases because people just like needed to vent. Like people needed to talk, and like there was, it's not that there was no one to talk to, but I think just having someone, and this is where, every woman in my family except me is a therapist basically, so maybe it like runs in my blood, or some people just say I have one of those spaces that you want to tell stuff to. I don't know. I guess it helps me and my job. But I just remember like people would just lay it out. They would just unload, and I would just sit there with the mic like out in front of them, and they would talk, and I would barely have to ask a question. Because I think it was just like people were like parsing through it as they spoke with me. Yeah, it was especially the folks, there were a couple cases. I remember one hauler up, where was it? It was near Little Doubles. And um I like the road wasn't really passable in a normal vehicle, so I had gone as far as I could, and then it was kind of broken, and I just like a guy with the ATV had just showed up there on his way somewhere, and he was like, "Hey, do you need a lift?" And I was like, "Yeah, can you just take me a little further up this road so I can talk to the people that are stuck?" And those folks like really hadn't, they hadn't been able to get out. They hadn't been able to, so like I remember I was there for like 3 hours, I was there for a long time.
I never knew how many ATVs were like truly in Eastern Kentucky until the flood happened too. It was just like everyone I knew, because that was like really the only way you could get around for like a week or two in a lot of and even longer in other places. Like you were talking about Little Doubles, it's super super remote, and I think like, well, it's interesting to me that people were like unloading in that way, because I feel like I had the opposite, and I'm glad that they were. I feel like I had the opposite thing where I was like, in mutual aid world, like we're trying to give people money, and they're like, no, 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 we didn't have anything, we're fine, and then we're like, no one's fine, no one is fine here, like just take money. So it's really interesting to me that like people wanted to talk. Like, were there any stories that really stood out to you? Like, you're talking about you got to talk to people that were sort of cut off for probably longer than people like me that were like in a downtown area. But were there any other stories that like really stood out to you from that from that natural disaster?
Yeah, I mean, and I did have that experience too. I'll say that, some people were like, "Well, you don't want my story, you want that person's story, but I'll just talk to you anyway." Sort of like that type of thing. But I do remember talking to a family up in Red Fox, and they were a Black family up in Red Fox, and I remember speaking with them about the experience of being Black in Eastern Kentucky and during this disaster, and just this feeling that it was heavy. It was like this feeling of n having been left behind for, not only in this case, but also for decades and 100 years, and like not really expecting any better than they were getting. And like that was something I encountered a lot from folks, but I think that was like certainly the heaviest conversation. And there were people in that family who were doing mutual aid, right? They were like, there was a person in that family who was spending all day every day like running like oxygen tanks and like different like Narcan, like clothes, like anything you can imagine, to people all over the place, and still just like not expecting to sort of get anything, get any help. And I think that's something in, disasters in rural Appalachia you see a lot. You see people who just have like learned not to expect very much, and sort of will say as much.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I like definitely want to hold on to that because I want to go back to that. But so you experienced and reported on these really devastating historic floods in eastern Kentucky, and then you left WMMT, you went to Grist maybe. In when did you start there? And Blue Ridge Public Radio. When did you start reporting there?
So I was a fellow at Grist for a year, starting in the beginning of 2023, going into the beginning of 2024. And so that was more of a remote national reporting gig where I sort of expanded. I still reported on Appalachia a lot, but it also expanded the scope a little bit. And was very lucky to be able to do that. And then I started at Blue Ridge Public Radio in Grist as a local reporter, local climate in the local reporters network. So I sort of do both local and national reporting. And I started there 1 month, no, 2 months before Helene hit. Two
Okay.
months, 2 months. So,
So
yes.
you start this new job and you're like your title, like you're a climate reporter. I mean, you're focusing on climate in Central Appalachia, right? Like which you definitely had to have the experience for already coming in. And then of course, September 2024, um were you in Tennessee at the time that Helene hit? I mean, this is when Central Appalachia gets hit by a hurricane, which no one is expecting, right? Like, no one's expecting that to happen. So I'm sure that you were. I think after Eastern Kentucky floods, what I'll say for myself was like, I was just waiting for the next thing. I was waiting for the next storm. So in my mind, I was like, and I didn't know where it was going to hit, right? Like, I didn't think, okay, in next year, Wattsburg is going to experience the same flood or Jackson's going to experience the same flood. I wasn't thinking of it like that, but I was like, this region particularly is going to hit, like something else is going to hit. And I kind of knew. I'm not sure if you had that same feeling, but
Did.
yeah,
I certainly did. I mean, if you look at the statistics or the predictions for Appalachia and the amount of extreme rainfall, temperature increase that we're expecting to see, you can't, I wish I could have. I remember speaking to mayors in Eastern Kentucky about this, like about their rebuilding process and their thoughts around rebuilding, and I was like, are you changing your approach, based on this flood? And it was mixed, right? Like some people were like, yes, so, we're thinking about high ground. Some people were like, no, we're resilient. We're gonna come back exactly as we were. And I remember just thinking to myself, like, I hope that works out for you, but I just don't have the same faith that
right.
that it's gonna, yeah, I think things are different now. And I remember feeling like we were getting a glimpse into a future. right? Like into a future of having to deal with this a lot more. But I didn't think it would be so soon. I did not think it would be so soon. And like the enormity of Helene and just like it made the Eastern Kentucky flood look small. I mean,
Yeah.
and that's saying so much.
I
Yeah.
I agree. Like I didn't I say I didn't go through Helene like in the sense that like I wasn't in North Carolina, Southwest Virginia, or East Tennessee, but here where I am in like Red River Gorge area, we had winds up to like 60 miles per hour from Helene. So I know in North Carolina though it topped to like 105. Like it was hurricane force winds hitting Western North Carolina on top of so much rain. And you are there and like getting like experiencing yet another historic storm, yet another 1,000-year flood in central Appalachia. And I'm curious, like, you said it already, like it made the 2022 flood feel small. What was different about this experience? And then I'm also curious, like, what did it feel like after maybe differ in the Eastern Kentucky floods?
There's so much to say. I mean, first of all, I think the infrastructural damage, and we saw that in Kentucky, there were a lot of damaged roads, a lot of damaged internet, electricity, water, like all that stuff was out for a lot of folks for a little while. But I think the geographic spread of the infrastructural damage that Helene wrought, I mean, there was for the first maybe two like week, you couldn't even get really in and out of Western North Carolina because so many roads had been broken or like were sort of cordoned off for search and rescue, but mostly because they weren't passable, like there were trees or landslides or whatever, and authorities were working to get all that stuff out. And then you had Asheville's water system, which is, sort of like very uniquely like sort of it was recently modernized. They got a huge EPA grant a few years ago to upgrade it actually to make it more climate resilient. And if they hadn't done that, I think it could have been much, much worse. But as it is, that water system was out for over 50 days. And, I think it really made me think about our rural or like mountain, I know Asheville isn't necessarily rural, but like our mountain water systems and like how old they are, and how difficult it is to replace and upgrade and how expensive it is to upgrade them and how this type of event can just like really just like sort of wreck everything at once. And the grid as well. I mean, power was out, internet was out for weeks, for even a month or more than a month for some people. So I think that was really like the overwhelming, that feeling of like like people were living a totally different existence for like so long. And then, I think there's this interesting factor of Western North Carolina being just in terms of its place in the public eye, in terms of it's maybe it's the class positioning of a lot of people who live there. It's very different from Eastern Kentucky. Like people go to Western North Carolina to enjoy themselves all the time. It's full of resorts. It's full of like it's the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. It's like a lot of people are like like the place that Western North Carolina holds in their heart is like a place that they go to enjoy themselves. And so there was more of an eye, like a national eye on it, whereas I think Eastern Kentucky, like unfortunately, I think people sometimes think of it as a place where disasters just happen or, problems just happen. And so there was this, I mean, there's so much to unpack, but I think the misinformation of it all was like really different as a result because we had people who were internet famous who were coming in and like filming and sending, information that wasn't necessarily correct about this storm back to, millions of followers. And so there was just this like sort of almost like an information fog because of like the lack of internet, because like so much was happening word of mouth, because of like these folks from maybe not Western North Carolina or who were living there, sort of like interpreting. But that's how you got rumors like FEMA was confiscating supplies, and that became like a huge, huge rumor. Or there was some rumors going around that the government had caused this hurricane to take lithium from, and it, Yeah, I don't know. It was a lot of different stuff. And so we were like fielding this like so many different huge wild circumstances.
I remember there was like there were white nationalist groups that were taking advantage of the place that it happened, it being the epicenter, sort of being like in central Appalachia, um, outside of like the coastal areas that got hit. And we're like coming in. I remember that happening. Like they were spreading a lot of misinformation, and then I remember like it got so bad that FEMA agents who had been working were like asked to pull back and stop because they felt like they were under threat, and it was just like I actually thought of you when that was happening because I'm like I can't imagine being a reporter trying to communicate what is actually happening, but also because of the infrastructure being so bad for so long, even trying to figure out what is actually happening. I really don't know how you did your job in the aftermath, in the media aftermath of all of that.
Well, I mean, really credit to our news director, Laura Lee, and to the BPR team, the Blue Ridge Public Radio team for like it was really teamwork. And I think we were only able to accomplish what we accomplished because of really strong leadership and because we were like we all, we tagged in and tagged out. We were all like going out and ground truthing information that we heard. If we heard there was water somewhere, like we would go out and try and find it just to make sure because things changed really fast. Or like where the gas, where there was gas available, where there was a working ATM, like there's stuff like that you just had to kind of like verify with your eyeballs. But because of the team, we were able to cover so much. We were able to cover what the different governor visits where they would come and land in a helicopter and survey the damage. And then we were also able to cover, how like FEMA's progression into the region and like how applications for aid were being opened and all of that stuff. But yeah, it was really it was once again a thing. I just remember like that feeling of watching and it's kind of funny. I seem to be at a party every time these disasters happen, and I don't know why. I was at my cousin's wedding when it happened in Shenandoah, and I remember just looking at my phone and being like feeling the feeling,
Did
and
you
being
feel
like,
like, am I even going to get, like, am I going to be able to get back? Because, like, the interstates were just.
yeah, I was like, I don't know how to get in. I don't know how to get in. And then I ended up going in through the Great Smoky Mountains National Park and it took like 6 hours. And then just feeling that like the headache, and the sort of feeling of like, oh gosh, like I thought I knew what to do, but I actually do not. I actually straight up do not know what to do. I once again feel unprepared and I think just every time that is how it's gonna feel. We just
Yeah.
do our best. Um
Yeah, it's interesting because like yeah, in 2022 you were at the Writers Workshop, which is especially as Louis Kwanzaa down as a party. And then like you are at a party but you're not even there, so you're like
like
you're
looking
also hearing things just like through maybe not even hearing anything. I don't know.
There were two coworkers we didn't hear from for a couple of days, like who were elsewhere in the region, not in Nashville, and we just didn't know if they were like alive or dead for like 2 to 3 days.
Gosh, that's so awful. Like we had a similar experience with a couple of coworkers at Apple Shop, but the infrastructure wasn't down that long, so we knew about those things sooner. But like, yeah, I just like it's a total mindfuck. It's just a total like, and the worst thing is like, I imagine for you in that time is like not being there, right? Just like not being there, being able to respond in the way that because I mean Um, I'm 100% like public radio, small public radio in your community is like a lifeline in those moments. We experienced it in 2022. How do you, I just like don't even know how you would even approach, where do you even begin when so many things are broken after a storm like that?
Absolutely. There was actually some advantage to being stuck outside for a few days because I was like the Kim Possible internet kid. I was like able to I was like the only one with internet. So I was able to like look up stuff. I did a lot of like little remote interviews with different officials about what was gonna happen and all that stuff. So there was a use, but it was odd. Yeah, it was certainly an odd feeling. And I think Hurricane Helene is we just went past the year anniversary and like I think like many people feel in Kentucky even now, like it's still happening. Like it's, this disaster just the tail is so long. People haven't even gotten like no one's gotten a hazard mitigation grant yet. No one's the hazard mitigation buyouts where if you live in a very dangerous, floodplain zone, FEMA will buy your house out and you can maybe move out of the danger zone. Like that hasn't been able to happen yet. So, I mean, there's just so much left to do.
Yeah, and um, I know that that's still happening from the Eastern Kentucky floods too. Like, some people have gotten offers, and some people have completed the process, and there's a lot of people and a lot of businesses that are still outstanding, which is just boggles the mind a little bit, but also not surprising after bearing witness to so many instances that people have had with FEMA, situations people have had with FEMA. Um, One question I was wondering, what exactly was the total for damage, estimated total for? I'm curious about the Eastern Kentucky floods and the after Hurricane Helene.
That's a great question. I wasn't able to find a number for Kentucky, but
Okay. No,
I
that's
did.
fine. I mean, I'm sure it's in the billions. Like I remember hearing like 30 billion at one time, but I don't know if that's super accurate and probably, like I said, I was in a daze after all of it. So someone could have said that and I'm like, that seems right.
I feel like I put it in a story somewhere and I was like, no, I don't know where it
Yeah,
is.
no, that's fine.
Uh, but for Helene, North Carolina is about 53 billion. It was a $53 billion disaster in North Carolina alone, and then I believe it was 250 billion total. So I mean, this is an expensive disaster. And so far in North Carolina, only about 11% of that cost has been covered by FEMA so far.
And what do you think most of that has been if people aren't getting by? Is it just infrastructure repair? I mean, I imagine.
It is individual assistance, like people have gotten individual assistance, but there is, the public assistance piece is often, I think it goes a little bit less discussed maybe, because it doesn't hit it's not as like emotional, but it is expensive. And so
Yeah.
you have a lot of local governments who are like the town of Hot Springs, North Carolina, basically lost its sewer plant, so they're gonna have to relocate it. And so that is going to be a $36 million price tag for a town that its annual budget is just under $2 million. So, you have towns that are just very, there's maybe like 540 people around that number living in Hot Springs. So it's just like these, small communities are just like trying to find they're like, trying to get money from FEMA. I think at this point, some are trying to also get it from elsewhere.
I forget about, that immediate public assistance that comes from FEMA afterwards. To be honest, because it's so small, it's like does not even scratch the surface of monetary damages that people have encountered. I'm curious, you talk about Western North Carolina as a different place compared to Eastern Kentucky. Just the way we experience it. I have those same feelings about Western North Carolina. I love Western North Carolina. Um, I don't know what it is that even like people from Appalachia that live like I live in the woods, but also I'm like, oh, I'd love to go to Western North Carolina for a weekend. Don't know what that's about, but I'm
It's a
curious.
special.
Like, what? Sorry.
Oh, I just said it's a special place. There's a lot of really big mountains. I think that's
Yeah,
part of
I think that is part of it, and I think I'm just like really curious. Did you see or have you experienced a difference, like year post Helene, 3 years post Eastern Kentucky? There's definitely a difference in how it's been reported nationally and followed nationally. But just maybe in the way that like local governments are interacting, because like my impression of local governments in Eastern Kentucky and some of my experience, there's even a distrust of those that are in local government, of like, maybe not distrust, but the cooperation with the federal government just doesn't feel popular, or like there is a resistance there. Even with the state government, like in Kentucky in particular, we have a lot of Republicans who are a little resistant to work with Andy Beshear because of optics. Now there are some that are like, they get it, they're totally on board, they're moving forward. It does, like, politics doesn't matter. But I do think it has come up in Eastern Kentucky's recovery. And I'm curious, like, is that happening? Have you seen things like that happen in North Carolina, in Western North Carolina? Just because, it's politically different, but in some communities it's like politically very similar to Eastern Kentucky.
Yeah, I remember I tried to broach this with a county manager in Mitchell County, North Carolina, which is a pretty rural area if you're familiar with like um Bakersville. That's where it's at, and Spruce Pine as well, which was really hard hit. It was really interesting because I think this was a conservative, politically conservative man. He didn't implicitly have a lot of trust in the federal government, and but he told me, he was like, listen, like without the federal government and its money, like this county would not be able to recover. And so he felt that through his interactions, with FEMA, and even though FEMA, can be frustrating and slow for many folks, I think he just felt, he was like, I see the need, I see why we need it. And so that was sort of his position, and that's one man. I'm interested, this is like reporting I would like to do, that I'm curious about how people's interactions with FEMA and other federal agencies have changed their thinking about the federal government, whether for the maybe more to less agreeable. I think it impacts folks. There's also been some like coalition building from local governments in Western North Carolina to sort of knock down the doors in DC and in Raleigh, and try and really like get state and federal money into communities that are smaller and maybe more overlooked. There's a group called the American Flood Coalition that's doing this, and it's a bipartisan group of local electeds, and they're grouping together and trying to get that money. And so I think it's been politically interesting to watch.
You got to group together to get the money. I think that is one thing that these small communities learn really quickly. It's like, we as a nonprofit whose budget is like, maybe $500,000 a year, probably less, are not going to be able to pull in what we could pull in collectively. And there's just so much like planning and thinking and like, you know, I hate to say build back better, whatever, but it's like that's the energy you have to come into after a disaster. It's like in Letcher County, in Wattsburg in particular, the flood maps are changing. The whole town is going to be considered in the floodplain. I imagine that will probably happen in North Carolina if it hasn't happened already. And you know, I'm like, how do you operate in a town, um, civically, like all of these things? If you want to run a business, whatever it is you're doing, how do you operate in a town that is considered in the floodplain? Because there's so much added costs for people that live in a floodplain that, about if like maybe you're buying a house. I remember when we were house hunting, I was like, we're not getting something in a floodplain. Like that is like an added 100 to 200 a month in flood insurance plus like flood trauma. I just didn't want to do it. And these areas are already so economically disadvantaged, right? This isn't even much as a question as it's me like thinking about these different areas. It's just like, I'm thinking like, how did they operate? How do you plan ahead? When you're like, we're in the floodplain, do you try to find a higher ground to build on? We have homes being built on higher ground in Eastern Kentucky right now, but like Martin, Kentucky is a really good example of their town is in the floodplain. They got a lot of money to move government buildings up to higher ground, and they've been doing that over time, but it has taken so long. It takes so long to do a project like that. And it takes so long to find land. It takes so long to get the money. It takes so long. And in that time, especially as we're seeing these disasters happen more frequently, they could be hit once again, or just like, God forbid, more than once. You know, there were floods in February, March of this year that hit some of those same places that were hit in 2022. So they've experienced it already again. It's just something I think about a lot. I'm just like, how do these areas move forward, and how do you keep morale high? And I don't know if you've like seen efforts that people are making to like move things forward in like a, while also like acknowledging like this is hard, but we're pushing ahead, you know, especially when this funding just takes so long to get.
Totally. Yeah, I mean it's and communities don't have that long to wait. I mean, it's a really challenging decision, and I think it's really easy, as a reporter to be like, "Well, why don't you want to move? Why don't you just move?" And it's like, "Well, it's like expensive, really difficult and emotional and like also, I mean, in Western North Carolina, we have the specific circumstance of being so dependent on tourism, right? Which is also maybe like part of its uniqueness as a place in the region is that all these cute little small towns, that have all the cute little stuff in them, they're all kept afloat by the tourist economy. And so if you move your cute little historic downtown and rebuild a maybe not as cute a historic but safer way, like all of a sudden you're weighing like, are you sacrificing are you sacrificing some of that? And that's the town's future, for now that I think a lot of leadership can see is in continuing to build that tourism economy. So there's a lot to weigh. And, I've certainly talked to town leaders who are not are not interested, they want to reopen and it's sort of like up to the businesses to decide what they want to do and it's up to the homeowners to decide what they want to do. And, FEMA's sort of like public assistance structure, like prior to this administration, there were stricter rules about if they were to give money to say a public building to, you know, to restore itself, there were certain requirements that the public building would have to be built to, depending on the damage it took. And those requirements are a lot looser now. And so, I think time will tell how that shakes out. But yeah, it's certainly a little different now than it was.
That, yeah, I hadn't even thought about those sort of things happening now. I'm curious, I don't know if you can give your opinion on this, but I would really am really interested in knowing. Helene happened right before the presidential election. So this meant that, also like you have the whole hassle of trying to figure out how people can vote in Western North Carolina after a natural disaster. But you also, in real time, you're seeing the federal response of this natural disaster through the Biden administration. Harris is running, who is Biden's VP. So, of course, they're linked. We know that's just how it is. And you have Donald Trump, who there's just a lot of misinformation coming from sources and people that have political interest in Trump being elected. Um, I think some of that I remember particularly like these low amounts that people were getting directly after the storm. It was like, that's all FEMA's going to give you. And there was a lot of just like people not understanding the FEMA process, which is its own bureaucratic nightmare and is bad. I'm not saying it's good, but like, um, just a lot of misunderstanding. Trump won North Carolina. It was close. It was really close. There were like historic numbers of voting in North Carolina, like early voting in North Carolina. And some of that was like in even Western North Carolina, I believe. So I'm curious what you can say and like how you think the Helene, if it did swing North Carolina to Trump. I don't know that, it would have went that way, but like, did you experience that on the ground? Did you feel those maybe attitudes shifting or anything in the immediate aftermath of Helene?
You know, I can't speak for the attitude shifting, but it's something that I thought was really interesting about how the Trump campaign interacted with Helene. Well, first of all, there's a sort of presidential theater, right, of like visiting the disaster zone. And there's no practical reason for the president to do it. It's about showing that the president cares. And it is seen. But also there's a lot to weigh, right? Like when you visit a disaster zone as a president, there's the motorcade and the security and the helicopters and all the stuff, and it like blocks up the road for, maybe like emergency personnel. And so Biden initially didn't visit for that reason. But Trump did visit around October 20th, 21st, I believe. And, it, I think, made it clearer in that visit that it was, that this was like a statement the campaign was making. The campaign wanted to make it clear that Trump supported Helene victims, and sort of according to the campaign in a way that the Biden administration didn't. And I wrote a story about this recently. But he started a GoFundMe for Helene victims. Didn't personally donate it, but a lot of prominent Republicans did raise about, as well as like, sort of ordinary people, including Helene victims themselves. There was a Helene victim I saw there who donated like $5. And, it's a little bit of a mystery why this choice was made as opposed to just telling people to donate to certain organizations, because the money went to organizations anyway. But it was clear that this was like a political message, that the campaign was sending, was like about like who is taking care of North Carolinians during Helene. So it's difficult to say to what degree that message was picked up, but it's certainly a message that the campaign was trying to send.
Yeah, and do you feel like the messages they're sending now, that I think they're sending now, saying we're cutting FEMA funding, we're closing FEMA down? I mean, it's illegal to do that. We know that. But also, a lot of things have happened that are technically illegal. And I do think there has been a desire amongst conservatives, because I remember hearing it even after the 2022 floods. Like, there has been this desire that government funding is a waste, and FEMA in particular. I think some of this is also spurred by Katrina. It's just like been a whole pattern since for the better, like the last 20, 30 years. Do you feel like that attitude of, the Trump administration saying we don't need FEMA has affected how those that are still recovering from Helene, are viewing this current administration, and maybe even just like viewing the federal government in general?
Yeah, it's a hard one. I'll say, like, if you don't mind if I detour a little bit into the weeds of history, for a moment. The Republican Party as it exists now, and sort of like American conservatism, and especially religious American conservatism, has been, historically pretty opposed to government aid, opposed to the New Deal, and like viewed it as a waste, and opposed to FEMA sort of like also on those grounds. And before the New Deal, a lot of that humanitarian aid work, that disaster relief work, was done by private entities, and a lot of those private entities were religious, Christian. And so, if you sort of like, I think there is a sense from the Republican Party of, maybe who is more qualified to, or like speedier, or more like morally correct in doing this work, is sort of maybe more of a like private organizations. That's sort of the maybe political bent that it is coming from. I know that organizations like Samaritan's Purse or Water Mission, or these sort of like really, really big private religious sort of ministry groups, have done a lot of rebuilding. And so people in Western North Carolina and elsewhere see that, and they say, okay, like, I'm not seeing guys in FEMA shirts, but I'm seeing guys in Samaritan's Purse shirts, and that's who's really doing the work. But it's hard because FEMA doesn't operate that way. They don't go around in a FEMA shirts and like a truck with FEMA. It's not about branding, it's the government. Um, so I think people have like a sort of a visual sense of who is helping that is both real and like reflected for real in who is helping, and also there's like sort of public help that is less visible. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I think that's like a dynamic that maybe like reflects where the Republican Party is at with regards to federal disaster aid. And then the other thing that arises from that is that while a Samaritan's Purse, they're extremely wealthy, they can rebuild a house like that, they can get you a new car, like they can do all this amazing stuff, but when it comes to the long haul, what are they committed to? Are they committed to helping governments fund their continual water system upgrades for the long haul? Like that's not what Samaritan's Purse does. Whereas FEMA is, this sort of like, for better or for worse, big bureaucracy that is more so set up to continually process these like bureaucratic problems that arise from emergencies like Helene. So yeah, I think if FEMA is weakened, then there might be some changes to the sort of long-termism of it all.
Yeah, that's sort of how I'm feeling. And also, it's just there are people working at FEMA that understand the water system. There are people working at FEMA, they understand this infrastructure. That's not to say that like there might not be people at these organizations that also do, but that's not their specialty. And that's been my worry, is just like long term, especially because Helene, so much damage happened to infrastructure. We've had crumbling infrastructure in Eastern Kentucky for years prior to the flooding. So there's just no way that a nonprofit can financially fill the gap of the federal government. That's just the reality. We're seeing it now with SNAP benefits potentially not coming on November 1st, and people are scrambling to figure out how to help. But even food banks are saying we can't. There will be gaps. There will be gaps.
We saw that with reproductive health after the fall of Roe v. Wade, right? Like we saw organizations getting a ton of funding initially and being able to float their work on it, and then but once the public eye was on something else, like that funding did slowed to a trickle.
Right, and it's interesting you talk about these optics. It just made me think of this. You're saying it's Samaritan's Purse in Western North Carolina. In Eastern Kentucky, it's been the Mennonites. It's been Mennonite aid organizations. And I remember someone saying to me, FEMA should stand for Find Every Mennonite Around, because they are the ones that are doing the work. And that is something that has stuck with me for a very, like, since I heard it. Anytime I see FEMA, that's what I think of. But I think it's like interesting, yeah. Just like you see who's doing this quick work, right? But it's just like no one wants to. There's like so many granular details, and it takes years for these things to happen or fully recover, places to fully recover. I think Katrina hit in 2005. The last FEMA case was closed in 2016. Bureaucracy is not good. There's so much red tape. I think it could be easier. I feel like, as someone that witnessed this disaster, it could be easier. There are things that need to be changed, et cetera, et cetera. I want to end though on some of your reporting that I have read in the, like, I think this was maybe like a 1 year anniversary piece that you did. And it was actually about, you know, I've talked a lot on this podcast about like the mental health effects and things you experience after a natural disaster hit, like Willa and I talked about in the last episode. And you talked to a couple who went through Helene together, and they had like these different, like during Helene, they're like, one's like, we should go, and the other one's like, no, we're staying here, and sort of how they've experienced it in the year after. And that was such an interesting story to me, and I'm wondering, like, I would love to hear anything, you might want to say that, since you actually reported the story for the podcast, like about reporting on that couple and their experience. And also just like, are there things popping up? I think we saw this a little bit in Eastern Kentucky, but not nearly enough. But like for people to be dealing with this like PTSD that they're experiencing after Helene.
Yeah, that story was like maybe it's weird to frame it this way because it's about something so traumatic, but it was like my little treat after doing like some more accountability work because I think I think as a climate reporter, like my big challenge is like how to make people want to read my stuff and not feel too sad to read it. And also for me, like I want to not feel sad every day. So I'm like, trying to find, because the climate beat, what's great about it is it's expansive. It's about like climate change touches like every part of human existence. So like really anything's a climate story. Like I once, I sent my coworker at BPR like an article about malls recently, and I was like, "This is a climate story. Like malls are a climate like haven, like because they're resilient to disaster." But anyway, I think a lot of reporting around disaster, and this might have touched on what you talked about with Willa because she's so sensitive to these things, but a lot of it involves digging up like these worst moments of people's lives over and over again. And you see a lot of reporters who are doing great work but they sort of you can see they're digging up these stories over and over the course of a year, over the course of years, let's say from the same event maybe, like asking people to recall that moment of like the scramble for their lives. And I knew that that was about to happen with the anniversary pieces. I knew a lot of them were going to look like that, and I just didn't want to go there. And like I was just like, how can we talk about how we've changed? Like how can we talk about you know climate change is this thing that's like scary, but also something that we're like reacting to and adapting to as human beings. And so I thought relationships were such an interesting way, to talk about a marriage and to be like, how do two people who love each other but maybe have different approaches, to emergencies, like how do they navigate this like incredibly stressful situation. Like I don't know a relationship that Helene didn't touch in some way. I know of people who got proposed to right after the storm, I know of divorces, like and I covered a divorce in that story as well because Helene made people think about what was really important to them and realize that maybe their husband just wasn't a part of the vision. And like yeah, it's I think as we move forward and like we continue to see increasing climate disasters in our region and elsewhere, I think we need to be like approaching it as humans and like really, really like viewing it like with the full spectrum of humanity. And because I think while it is like a scientific story, it is a technical story, the climate story, it's also just truly a story about like us and like human like the continuation of human history and like how we're like literally going to keep ourselves going.
Yeah, climate reporting to me, where we are right now, feels like the most important historical documentation we could probably be doing right now. I have a nephew who is not even a year old, and I anticipate them experiencing climate change in some way, as we all are, and then questioning why was nothing done about this? What were people thinking 20 years ago, So to me it's like these are the records people are going to go back to and be like, "Oh, this happened." So I just think it's like so important, and it's funny that you said people got engaged. My husband and I, he proposed to me 3 days after uh, the 2022 floods. Yeah, I didn't know if you knew that. And we kept it. It was like such a weird thing too, because we were like so thrilled, and also we were like, we're not telling anyone because everyone is miserable right now. It was just like we did not feel comfortable talking about it. But he thought the ring got lost because he ordered the ring through Etsy, and he thought my ring got lost in the mail because of the flooding, and it hadn't arrived yet. And as soon as he got it out of the mailbox, he proposed to me. So it was like this very weird, interesting moment. That's why I appreciated so much your reporting about relationships because, um, yeah, I mean, my husband and I, we already knew we were probably going to get married at that point, but it was just like this is it. This is the time. Yeah, and thinking now back to that, like, it's also very ironic because we wanted to go be happy somewhere for like a day and like take a break from mutual aid work, and we went to Blowing Rock, North Carolina.
Word.
Yeah, and then they experienced their own thing 2 years later. Wow. I'm
So
having a full circle moment right now.
it is a full circle moment. That is wild. Yeah, but I think like and this is what not to I try to stray away from like cheap hope, like in the wake of disaster, because I know there's a lot of like resilience, type of talk, and it can feel a little trite. But I do think there's like this quality in disasters where they like, as we survive them and help our community survive them, like they crystallize things that we want to keep and throw away about like our own lives and like the society that we live in. Whether it's like immediately after disaster, like there's this sort of like social safety net that evolves. And I was just talking to actually some doctors about that just the other day for a story who, they were like all these people who like couldn't get healthcare usually, like they were able to get it. Um, During that period and it fell away. But like how can we hold on to like that aspect of it, right? Like while coming out of it. So and then also, it makes us think so much about who we love, who we care about, what's important to us. So yeah, it's interesting. It's always yielding more thoughts.
That's the perfect way to put it. It is always yielding more thoughts. And it truly does touch every part of your life. And I'm so glad that you are doing this reporting in the region because unfortunately you have so much firsthand experience in ways that of experiencing like literal climate disasters that are 1,000-year floods. I keep doing it like air quotes 1,000-year floods because
I know
wow.
I'm always like, am I 1,000 years old then?
Yeah, right.
Maybe.
It feels that way. Sometimes I'm like, maybe we are. But yeah, unfortunately, you have this firsthand experience. But also, I think that just like lends so much power to your reporting. Like, just the idea of like not coming in and asking people to relive the most traumatic moments of their life and instead be like, hey, how's your relationship changed since this flood? And it's something that I think people don't, that's not the first thing they think about. So I really appreciate your reporting and the way that you have been approaching reporting on climate change and catastrophe in this region in particular.
Thank you so much. That means so much coming from you, and like I really appreciate your work out here too.
Oh, thank you.
Loving the podcast.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Thanks so much to Katie for coming on and talking about her experiences. You can find Katie's stories at grist.org. Thank you to the Kentucky Foundation for Women for helping fund Mountain Laurel's Women of Appalachia. This podcast is produced and edited by me, Jessica Miles. Our artwork is created by Hayden Miles, and our theme music is produced by Kenny and Hayden Miles. If you'd like to support the show, you can find me on Substack at mountainlaurels.substack.com. You can also follow the show on Instagram.